the U.S. Space Program, presentation and narration by Eddie Wright. The birth of the U.S. Space Program, or NASA, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, was primarily due to the Soviet Union's launch of the satellite Sputnik on October 4, 1957. The U.S. Navy initially attempted to launch a competing satellite in December of 1957 but failed. However, the U.S. Army successfully launched Explorer 1 on January 1, 1958 and Vanguard 1 on March 17, 1958. After its creation, NASA had begun Project Mercury, which was a single-man program to see if humans could survive in space. On April 9, 1959, the world was introduced to the Mercury 7. These U.S. astronauts were Scott Carpenter, Gordon Cooper, John Glenn, Gus Grissom, Wally Schirra, Alan Shepard, and Deke Slayton. The rivalry between the U.S. and Soviet Union's battle for space dominance continued, with cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin becoming the first man in space on April 2, 1961. However, on May 5, 1961, Alan Shepard became the first U.S. astronaut in space aboard the Mercury Redstone rocket, followed by Gus Grissom on July 21st aboard the Liberty Bell 7. On February 20, 1962, John Glenn made 3 orbits of the Earth aboard the Friendship 7 spacecraft, followed by Scott Carpenter in May on the Aurora 7 and Wally Schirra in October aboard the Sigma 7. Carpenter completed 3 orbits while Schirra completed 6 orbits. Gordon Cooper was the final astronaut of Project Mercury when he completed 22 orbits of Earth on May 15, 1963. The Gemini program was announced on December 7, 1961. The project consisted of a 2-man spacecraft and was considered a stepping stone between Mercury and Apollo missions. The program had 12 flights, with Gemini 3 being the first manned flight and launched on March 23, 1965, with astronauts Gus Grissom and John Young. The flight lasted for 5 hours and completed 3 orbits. The following flights of Gemini 4, 5, and 7 had longer flights consisting of 62, 120, and 206 orbits. The program saw many successes for the U.S. space program, such as a 22-minute spacewalk, 14-day survival in space by humans, and the first docking of another space vehicle. The project ended after 4 more Gemini missions in 1966, further perfecting rendezvous and docking methods. The next NASA program was one that would take humans to the moon, the Apollo program. The program consisted of 11 manned missions between 1968 and 1972. Before the program began, tragedy struck on January 27, 1967, during the test of the Apollo 1 capsule. A fire broke out on the launch pad, killing astronauts Gus Grissom, Edward White, and Roger Chaffee. The early Apollo flights consisted of Earth orbit and circumlunar tests to prep for President Kennedy's vision of a moon landing. The 6 lunar landing missions were Apollo 11, 12, 14, 15, 16, and 17, which were aboard the Saturn rocket. The very first lunar landing took place on July 20, 1969, during the Apollo 11 mission commanded by astronauts Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins. Neil Armstrong was the first man to set foot on the moon and uttered his famous "one giant leap for mankind" statement. The Apollo 11 mission spent approximately 21 hours on the lunar surface and returned to Earth with 47.7 pounds of lunar samples. Tragedy nearly struck on the following Apollo 13 mission when an oxygen tank exploded on the spacecraft service module. However, astronauts James Lovell, John Swigert, and Fred Hayes successfully returned to Earth after aborting the lunar landing mission by using the Aquarius lunar module as a lifeboat. The last 3 Apollo missions from 1971 to late 1972 took much longer expeditions from the lunar landers by using a lunar roving vehicle. During the last lunar landing mission on Apollo 17, astronauts Eugene Cernan and Harrison Smith roamed for 21 miles on the lunar rover and left behind a plaque that stated, "Here man completed his first exploration of the moon, December 1972 AD. May the spirit of peace in which we came be reflected in the lives of all mankind." In 1981, the Space Shuttle program began after the success of the Test Shuttle Orbiter Enterprise. The 5 space shuttles that were used for manned space missions were Columbia, Challenger, Discovery, Atlantis, and Endeavour. The Space Shuttle Columbia was the first orbiter to launch into space on April 12, 1981, with astronauts John Young and Bob Crippen. 135 flights occurred during the program and had a number of accomplishments, including Space Lab, the Hubble Space Telescope, multiple satellite deployments, and maintenance, docking with the Russian Mir space station, and construction and docking of the International Space Station. The program also introduced diversity into the U.S. space program. Sally Ride became the first American female in space on June 1983, and Guion Bluford became the first African American in space 2 months later. The final space shuttle mission occurred in July 2011 when the shuttle Atlantis lifted off to deliver supplies to the International Space Station. The shuttle is now in the John F. Kennedy Space Center Museum, which I visited last year. Just like the Kennedy assassination and 9/11 terrorist attacks, most Americans remember where they were on January 28, 1986, when the Challenger space shuttle exploded 73 seconds after liftoff. The tragedy was caused due to leaking exhaust from a solid rocket booster that burned through the skin of the external fuel tank. The accident killed all 7 astronauts: Gregory Jarvis, Judith Resnick, Francis Scobie, Ronald McNair, Michael Smith, Ellison Onizuka, and Krista McAuliffe, who was going to be the first teacher in space. The incident was witnessed on television by schools across the country. A second space shuttle tragedy occurred on February 1, 2003, when Shuttle Columbia broke apart on re-entry. The accident was caused by hot plasma gases penetrated the shuttle's space frame through a hole in the left side wing. Astronauts David Brown, William McCool, Michael Anderson, Kalpana Chawla, Rick Husband, Laurel Clark, and Ian Ramon were killed in the accident. The International Space Station was constructed starting in 1998 and orbits 230 miles above the Earth. The ISS is an international venture including the countries of the U.S., Canada, Europe, Russia, and Japan. The space station is powered by solar arrays and includes 2 U.S. modules, Destiny and Node 1. The ISS can hold approximately 6 crew members and is 4 times larger than the Mir space station, weighing 925,000 pounds. Currently, NASA is planning for its future by building spacecraft to travel to Mars and exploring near-Earth asteroids in the years between 2020 and 2030. For the mission to Mars, NASA is developing the Orion spacecraft. The Orion spacecraft will carry 4 astronauts on missions beyond the Moon and will launch on the SLS, or Space Launch System. The SLS is an advanced heavy-lift rocket that would allow exploration deeper into space. Commercial space flight is also being developed by private companies such as SpaceX and Virgin Galactic to allow ordinary citizens to travel